Hi guys, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be discussing about how are we going to derive the long run average cost curve. Now, before this video, I've already posted a video on the long run average cost curve, which was explaining what it is and how do firms benefit from, due to economies of scale, how they benefit from increasing returns to scale and then constant returns, and how as the firm increases its size or scales up, how does it ultimately leads to diseconomies of scale causing decreasing returns. So basically this video is all about how are we going to actually derive the long run average cost curve, or basically regarding the derivation of the long run average cost curve. Guys, now first of all, remember that when you're talking about the long run average cost curve, the LRAC, or the long run average cost curve, is the lower envelope of our short run average cost curves. Now what that means is you'll see in this video. So watch this video till the end. So now we know, guys, that in the short run, firms are facing fixed factors such as capital, right? And that's what most textbooks and what economic theory is suggesting us, right? And so while the only variable factor they have is only labor, and in contrast to the short run, they have the long run where capital and labor both are variables, so which means that they could easily increase and decrease it, right? Now, we know that our short run average cost curve shows the average cost for various quantities, right? So this is and it's U shape. So this is our short run average cost curve, which is showing the average cost for various quantities where capital is fixed in some amount, right? So when you're drawing the short run average cost curve, we know that our capital is fixed, right? We could have one machine or maybe one plant, right? And and that is exactly what makes them the short run cost curve, since these short run cost curves, they correspond to some fixed level of capital, right? And these short run average cost curve is U shaped, which is corresponding, again, this is what you're going to write in the exam, that the short run average cost curve is corresponding to some fixed amount of capital, right? Which could be a single plant, or maybe which has, let's say, two machines even, right? Something like that. So it has some amount of fixed capital, right? So that is, any individual short run average cost curve is corresponding to some fixed amount of capital at some level, right? So guys, this means that depictions of many short run average cost curves is really just showing one of the many short run average cost curves. And this is because there are lots of different levels of capital that a single firm could have or hold. So if you're saying that there are many short run average cost curves, and which is technically showing us different levels of capital or different plant sizes that a firm may have, right? So to put it differently, we can think about it as, there's a theoretical short run average cost curve which is associated with every possible level of capital or plant size that a firm could have, right? So different average cost curves, different short run average cost curves are depicting different plant sizes, right? So guys, now let's say that the firm has this SRAC1, which is the short run average cost curve one for any particular level of capital. The reason why we're saying for any particular level of capital, because we know that whatever the capital is, that would be fixed in that time period, right? And the only output the firm could increase or decrease is by hiring more variable factors to that particular plant size or factory or that fixed capital, right? Now, for a different level of capital, maybe a different plant size, a different factory, assuming that whatever different factory it is, that would then become the fixed factor as well. The second factory would become the fixed factor as well. So if you're saying that at a different level of capital, if the firm was then later fixed at that level, as in at that level of capital, so if you have another factory, it's a long run, but then that long run is again representing another short run. For that period, it's that long run, although a long run has started, but then there's another short run, right? Because now we have two factories, and the second factory is again now the fixed factor for us, right? So we have another short run average cost curve associated for that second factory. So exactly, so that's what exactly I'm saying, that we have another SRAC2 for that another level of capital, or that another factory. And this SRAC2 is corresponding to the different level of capital that we have now that the firm could hold, right? So to make some sense out of it, or to put some thought behind it, or to give some intuition to this around this, we can think about SRAC1, right? We can think about SRAC1 as being associated with, let's say, one factory or one single plant, and whatever equipment it has in that plant, and let's say SRAC2 as being associated with a different factory, or maybe a medium-sized factory, right? A bigger factory than the factory where SRAC1 was associated to, corresponding to, yeah, right? Or maybe SRAC2 corresponding to a different factory with some larger equipment or a bigger equipment, right? Which is more suited, and this factory, the second factory, or the medium-sized plant, bigger than the smaller size plant, which is corresponding to SRAC1, is now, let's say, more suited to producing larger amounts, right? So we have another SRAC curve for that, which is SRAC2. Now, one thing that I would like you to tell is that you can see over here, for example, this diagram is telling us that, um, for any of the amounts that is in this, red shaded area, you can see, um, these quantities within this red shaded area, they are not overlapping between these two curves for any quantities in this red shaded area. The reason is that, for example, if the firm is for example, if the firm will let's say, if the firm is choosing to produce, let's say, a quantity of QA, then it will have a different, it will have a different average cost for QA based on if it chooses to produce QA at the smaller factory versus if it chooses to produce QA in the medium sized factory, right? So SRAC1 having the smaller factory, SRAC2 with corresponding to the medium-sized factory. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not that the cost would be the same, right? So, and that is exactly what I'm trying to tell you guys over here, is that what you guys should note over here is that there isn't any overlap between these two curves for some quantities. There won't be any overlap, right? So if the firm was to choose to, let's say, to produce a quantity in this region, it can choose the level of, the firm can actually choose the level of capital which is associated with, SRAC1 or SRAC2, which simply means that it can choose whether it should, produce QA units in the first factory or maybe the second factory, whatever. So which plant would it prefer, right? So, and obviously it would prefer the plant which is giving the lower average cost, which would obviously be the point B. I mean, it would choose to produce um, at a plant size where, the average cost is lower, and which is obviously at point B, because the average cost that comes at point B would be much lower than the average cost that comes at point A, right? So, given that, there we have an SRAC curve which is associated with every possible level of capital, right, that a firm could possibly hold, we can actually just fill out our whole diagram. We can actually fill out our whole diagram like this. We can actually fill out our whole diagram like this, making multiple short and average cost curves representing multiple plants, multiple corresponding capitals. So we could sort of, just like I said, we could fill out our whole complete diagram, which I've done below as well, with different short run average cost curves. So I've made like 8 different short run average cost curves. It's not that there would be 8 or 9 different short run average cost curves representing different corresponding capitals and plant sizes, but the point is that there could be many of it, right? In between these, you could be many of it, but I have drawn it just to sort of make it simplify things for us, and so that you could understand the concept. So these 8 SRAC curves, guys, are all associated with different levels of capital. When you say different level of capital, you're actually trying to say, the level as in the extent of capital, which will obviously differ as the firm grows in size and it scales up, and which is technically trying to say, simpler way to put it forward is, different level of capital sounds a bit more technical, but a simpler way would be a smaller plant size versus the larger, medium-sized plant size versus the larger plant size. So definitely, when you are at SRAC 8, the short-run average cost 8, the plant size would be much bigger than the plant size at, the average cost SRAC 2. right? Because this is representing scaling up and growth, right? So what we're trying to say is, and so let's say for the purpose of simplicity for this video only, let's assume that there are only 8 possible short-run average cost curves for a firm, and these are associated with all the various levels of capital that the firm could hold, like 8 different factories of different sizes, right? So guys, now that we have all these short-run average cost curves in front of us, we can actually think or put our head into thinking about how would a firm behave or what would a firm do in the long run. And this will, because this is just production behavior that we are sort of trying to figure out, right? And if we put our head to it, it will tell us about how would the long run average cost curve, it will look like. And guys, just to recall again, the firms in the long run can choose the amount of and the level of capital that they wish, and they did not have this privilege in the short run. So let's just say that, let's take any quantity. Let's take a quantity of maybe Q, let's say Q star, right? So if we take a quantity of Q star, let's say this quantity Q star, right? If we take a quantity of Q star, units of output, let's say, and one part, and we want to see that, you know, where in the long run would or let's say, if we take a quantity of Q star and we want to see that, we ask this question that in the long run, what will be the average cost for the firm in the long run if they want to make Q star units of output? And I ask you this question. And one part of your response would be, to this question would be like, well, the firm could choose anywhere. I mean, the firm has the privilege to choose whether it wants on which plant it wants to operate on, right? So the firm can actually choose the level of capital that they wish. And so if that's the case, then it could either be on the third plant, which corresponds to, as in, it could either produce on SRAC 3 or SRAC 4, which corresponds to, let's say, plant 3 and plant 4, right? But it would make rational and economic sense that they choose the level of capital that corresponds to the cheapest possible way, or that corresponds to the cheapest way of producing Q star units. So for example, at Q star, you know so for example, in order to produce Q star units, the firm has two options. The firm can produce it using the amount of capital that is associated with SRAC 4, right? With SRAC 4, let's say point X on SRAC 4 is representing a lower average cost than, let's say, point Y on SRAC 3, right? So it could use the amount of capital that is associated with SRAC 3, in which case the average cost would be much higher. But of course, the firm would use the amount. But the thing is that a rational producer would use the amount and the level of capital that is associated with SRAC 4, right? Because the average cost of producing Q star units at SRAC 4 is lower, right? So hence the average cost of producing Q star units would be much lower. And the average cost, let's say you could say that the average cost in the long run would be somewhere around this point, right? Would let's say we could say that it would be, we can say that the average cost of producing Q star units would be AC1 in the long run, right? Because, and the reason is that the firm would choose to be on SRAC4 rather than rather than producing Q star units using, the capital associated with SRAC3, right? Because that's what the cheapest possible option is. And when we are drawing the LRAC curve, we are assuming that the firms are, you know, that the firms are using the that the firms are rational in terms of choosing the lowest trying to produce the output at the lowest possible average cost, or using the least combination, right? Or basically trying to sort of minimize their cost, or using the cost minimizing choice, basically, right? So in the long run, you could say that your average cost of producing Q star units would be AC1, because that's our cost minimizing choice. And the point is that, although this point X is a point on the short run, but then why am I saying that in the long run this would be our average cost? Because ultimately we'll see that the long run cost curve would actually envelop these series of short run average cost curves, right? So, and similarly, guys, if we sort of think about other quantities, if we think about other quantities like let's say maybe Q1, and maybe the firm wants to produce Q1 units. So let's say Q1 units maybe somewhere over here. So let's say Q1 units somewhere over here. So in this case, Q1 units, if the firm wants to produce, let's say Q1 units, the firm would choose to be, the firm would choose to choose the level of capital that basically is corresponding to SRAC2 rather than choosing the level of capital and the plant that is corresponding to SRAC1, right? So guys, if we sort of think about all the possible quantities that a firm could produce, like all the possible quantities that a firm could end up producing, right? Then in order to so all the possible quantities that the firm could produce, in order to find the average cost which is sort of associated with the production of those quantities, and therefore find the long run average cost curve for the firm. So what we would be doing is that we would be sort of tracing out, we would be we would be tracing out the lowest parts of all the possible short run average cost curves. So let's sort of trace out the lowest parts of the possible short run average cost curve. So something like this would have, so something like this, right? So so you know essentially what's happening here is that if we trace out these lowest parts of the lowest parts of all the possible short run average cost curves, and so if we try to connect them, so we have what we have is we have you can see that we have a long run average cost curve. We have a long run average cost curve. Now this curve is not sort of smooth because I have only taken 8 different plants or 8 different short run average cost curves, but obviously we would have many short run average cost curves between these, right? For the sake of simplicity, I just took 8. So you see that we have a long run average cost curve, which is actually the lower envelope of the short run average cost curves. So we have a short run average cost curve. Sorry, we have a long run average cost curve, which is the lower envelope, which is the lower envelope of the short run average cost curves, and it's basically a lower envelope of the short run average cost curve because technically what it's doing is just hugging our short run average cost curve from the bottom, right? Yeah. So basically, in reality, if we recognize, right, if we recognize that a firm could choose different levels of capital, if we recognize that a firm does has the power to choose different levels of capital in the long run, and if we choose the lower envelope, if now listen to this very carefully, if we choose the lower envelope of the multitude of the short run average cost curves, right? If we choose the lower envelope of the multitude of short run average cost curves, a firm might have, a smooth long run average cost curve just like this, right? And you guys are sort of familiar with the shape. We've already discussed that in the previous videos as well, right? And so that is how the long run average cost curve is derived. So if we trace out the lower parts of a short run average cost curve, right? So the long run average cost curve is basically envelopes. The long run average cost curve envelopes around the bottom of these short run average cost curves. And remember that this entire envelope is the short run average cost curve itself, and it defines the average cost. It's actually so each point on the long run average cost curve is defining the average cost, what the average cost is, as we move down from, one plant size to another. Since on the long run average cost curve, there are multitude of tangency points with the short run average cost curves, right? So as we know that in the long run both capital and labor are variable, and as we move from one short run SRAC from one short run SRAC from one short run SRAC to another short run SRAC, remember that the other short run SRAC would be below it, right? To another short run SRAC, right? So all factors of production are variable, we know that. However, once we are on the another short run SRAC, that is SRAC2, then that we are then constrained by the fixed capital, which is, so for example, plant 2, or which, so initially we sort of moved to another plant, we made another plant, and then our long run has kicked in. But then that second plant is now become our fixed factor as well, right? So that is exactly what I've written here, that we are constrained by the fixed capital at the larger plant size, right? So guys, remember that the collection of these short run average cost curves, it sort of provides the ingredients for a long run average cost curve. So long run average cost curve is basically a lower envelope of these short run average cost curves, hugging all these short run average cost curves from the bottom line. Though you don't need to really write this line, but what you really need to write this line is, the line that you need to write is that you're going to trace out the as in the long run average cost curve, which is traced out, is basically the lower envelope of the short run average cost curves, and where the short run average cost curves are tangent, multiple short run average cost curves are tangent, you know, to the and if you to the long run average cost curve. So if you sort of join these points of tangencies, you'll actually end up having a long run average cost curve, right? So these different points, if you jot down these different points, if you join them, you actually end up having a long run average cost curve. So and the point what I'm trying to say is that between these, I mean, there would be there would be many short run average cost curves. It's not like this. If we sort of put our head to it, there would be many points of multitude of points of tangencies, multitude short run average cost curves. So yeah, that's how it is. That's how you sort of derive the long run average cost curve. Okay, so I hope you understood this video, and I'll see you all in the next video.